It started with a glance. Quick, fleeting, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. The weekend had been planned for months, a family gathering at her house. My wife's sister, Elena, was staying with us for a few days, visiting from out of town. I had always liked Elena. She was vibrant, lively, and shared the same sense of humor as my wife, but there was always something more. Something I never allowed myself to acknowledge. It wasn't until that Saturday night, after the dinner had ended, the dishes were cleared, and everyone had settled into the rhythm of conversation, that I noticed the way she looked at me. It was subtle, just a flicker in her eyes, a lingering gaze that made the air between us feel charged. I dismissed it, thinking I must be imagining things. But as the evening progressed, I realized it wasn't my imagination. Elena sat on the arm of the chair opposite me, her eyes catching mine more often than they should have. Each time, I found it harder to look away. The conversation around us became background noise as the unspoken tension grew. My wife, Emily, was laughing with her parents, completely unaware of the silent communication between her sister and me. It was innocent at first, just stolen glances and small smiles, but the longer the night went on, the more I became aware of her presence. Every time she crossed the room, every time she laughed, it felt like there was a current pulling us closer. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, an unexplainable anticipation building inside me. At one point, Elena leaned in close, her arm brushing against mine as she reached for her glass. The contact was brief, but the warmth of her skin sent a jolt through me. I caught her eye, and there it was again, that look. This time there was no mistaking it. There was something there, something forbidden and thrilling. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that this was my wife's sister. This couldn't be happening. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more aware I became of her. Every movement, every glance, only added to the growing tension between us. The night wore on, and the family began to disperse, heading off to bed one by one. Soon it was just the three of us, Emily, Elena, and me, sitting in the living room. The air was thick with unspoken words, and I could feel the tension coiling tighter inside me with each passing minute. "I'm going to turn in," Emily finally said, standing up and stretching. "Long day tomorrow." I nodded, my heart racing as she kissed me goodnight. As she disappeared up the stairs, I realized I was alone with Elena. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I swallowed hard, unsure of what to do or say. But Elena broke the silence. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly, her voice teasing but with an edge of something more. I forced a smile. "Just tired, I guess." She tilted her head, studying me for a moment, her eyes flicking over my face. "Sure," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. She stood up, and for a moment, I thought she was going to leave. But instead, she stepped closer, her eyes locking onto mine. My breath caught in my throat as she moved toward me, stopping just a few inches away. "You don't seem tired to me," she whispered, her voice low and filled with something that made my heart race. Before I could respond, she reached out, her hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent a shockwave through me. I froze, my mind racing, trying to process what was happening. This was wrong, so wrong. But the way she looked at me, the way her fingers lingered on mine, made it impossible to pull away. "Elena," I started, my voice shaky. But she silenced me with a soft, knowing smile. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't say anything." And then, before I could stop her, she took my hand and gently pulled me toward the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed her, my mind screaming at me to stop, but my body moving on its own. We reached the closet at the end of the hall, and without a word, she opened the door and pulled me inside. The small space was dark, the air thick with the scent of her perfume. I could feel her standing close to me, her body just inches from mine. The tension between us was unbearable now, the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on me like a vice. "Elena, we can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But she was already reaching for me, her hands sliding up my arms, her fingers tracing a path that made my skin burn. "I know," she whispered back, her breath warm against my neck. But I can't stop. Her words hung in the dark air between us, and before I could even process the meaning of them, her lips were on mine. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, but it quickly deepened, and I felt myself slipping further into the pull of her. My mind screamed at me to stop, to push her away, to think of Emily upstairs, unaware of what was happening just a few feet away. But my body had a different plan, my hands instinctively moving to her waist, pulling her closer. In the confined space of the closet, every touch, every breath, felt amplified. The scent of her skin, the heat radiating between us, it was overwhelming. My heart pounded in my chest as the kiss grew more urgent, our bodies pressing against one another in a way that left no room for doubt about what was happening. I knew this was wrong. The guilt gnawed at me with every passing second, but the desire, the hunger that had been building all night, drowned out the rational part of my brain. Elena's hands were in my hair, pulling me closer, her lips demanding more. And I gave in, losing myself in the moment, in the heat of her touch. Her hands moved to the buttons of my shirt, her fingers working quickly to undo them. My mind spun as I realized how far this was going, how impossible it would be to turn back now. But I didn't stop her. I couldn't. My own hands moved of their own accord, sliding down her sides, feeling the curve of her waist, the soft fabric of her dress beneath my fingers. "Elena," I whispered, pulling away just enough to catch my breath. "We can't do this." Her eyes met mine in the dim light filtering through the cracks of the door, and for a moment, I saw the same conflict reflected in them. But then she shook her head, her fingers gently grazing my jawline. "I know it's wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her own guilt. "But I've wanted this. I've wanted you for so long." Her confession sent a wave of shock through me. Had this tension been building for longer than I realized? Had I been blind to it all along? I stared at her, the reality of her words sinking in, and for a moment, everything froze. But then she kissed me again, and the world tilted on its axis once more. The heat between us was unbearable now, every touch igniting something deeper, something more dangerous. The space felt smaller, the walls closing in as our bodies moved together, pushing us further into the inevitable. I could feel her breath on my skin, her hands pulling me closer, and all the while, my mind raced with thoughts of Emily. What would she think if she knew? How could I explain this to her? To myself? But in that moment, all I could think about was Elena. The way her body fit against mine, the way her lips tasted, the way she made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I was losing myself in her, and the more I gave in, the more I wanted. Suddenly, there was a noise outside the door, a creak, a distant footstep, and we both froze. My heart stopped, panic seizing my chest as the reality of what we were doing hit me full force. Emily could come downstairs at any moment. If she found us like this, there would be no explaining, no hiding. We were teetering on the edge of disaster. Elena must have felt it too because she pulled back, her breathing ragged, her eyes wide with fear. For a long moment, we just stood there in the dark, the weight of what we had almost done hanging heavily between us. "We need to stop," I whispered, my voice barely steady. She nodded, her breath shaky as she backed away slightly, her hand lingering on my arm for just a moment longer before letting go. "I know," she murmured, her voice thick with regret. The tension between us was still palpable, the unspoken desire lingering in the air even as we tried to regain control. I took a deep breath, my heart still racing, and reached for the door handle. As I opened it, the light from the hallway flooded into the closet, illuminating the space that had held so much forbidden temptation just moments ago. I stepped out first, glancing nervously up the stairs, half expecting to see Emily standing there, but the house was still. Elena followed behind me, her eyes downcast, her shoulders tense. We stood there in awkward silence for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing what to say, how to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, Elena looked up at me, her expression a mix of guilt and sadness. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I shook my head, my own guilt weighing heavily on my chest. "No, I'm sorry. This should never have happened." She nodded, but there was something in her eyes that told me this wasn't over. The desire, the attraction, it was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the next opportunity to emerge. And that terrified me, because now that we had crossed this line, there was no going back. No matter how hard we tried to ignore it, the tension between us had been unleashed, and it would never fully disappear. Elena turned to walk away, her steps slow and deliberate, but before she reached the end of the hall, she glanced back at me, her eyes filled with a longing that made my heart ache. I wanted to call her back, to finish what we had started, but the weight of my guilt kept me rooted to the spot. As she disappeared around the corner, I was left standing alone in the dimly lit hallway, my mind racing with 1,000 conflicting emotions. The guilt, the desire, the confusion, it was all too much to process. I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes as I tried to steady my breathing, but the memory of her touch, her lips, lingered, impossible to forget. I stayed in that hallway for what felt like hours, though it could only have been a few minutes. The house was still quiet, the only sound the faint creak of the floor beneath my feet as I shifted my weight. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. What had just happened, what could have happened, and most of all, what it meant. How had I let things get so far? The guilt was immediate and overwhelming, but at the same time, the memory of Elena's touch burned fresh in my mind, impossible to shake. The desire, the attraction, it wasn't just her fault. I had wanted it too. And now, standing here in the aftermath, I had no idea how to reconcile the two. I needed to pull myself together, to clear my head. I couldn't let Elena's presence linger in my thoughts, especially not with Emily sleeping just upstairs. My wife, my loving, trusting wife, who had no idea that her sister and I had just crossed a line that could never be undone. The weight of it all was unbearable. I went to bed that night, lying beside Emily, the silence between us filled with the secrets I now carried. I turned on my side, facing away from her, unable to meet her gaze. Guilt gnawed at me, and yet, even as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't stop thinking about Elena. The way her breath had felt against my neck, the heat of her skin against mine. Sleep came slowly, fitful and filled with fragmented dreams of what had almost happened. And when I woke the next morning, the weight of it was still there, heavy and suffocating. The next few days were a blur of normalcy on the surface, but underneath, everything felt different. Elena and I avoided each other as much as possible, careful to keep our interactions brief and superficial. But every time I saw her, every time I heard her voice, the tension between us buzzed just beneath the surface, threatening to spill over at any moment. Emily didn't seem to notice. She was busy with work, with family, with life. I tried to act normal, tried to pretend that everything was fine. But I could feel the distance growing between us, a distance I didn't know how to bridge. And then one afternoon, everything came to a head. It was a quiet Sunday. Emily had gone out to run errands, leaving me and Elena alone in the house. The silence between us was unbearable, thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. I tried to focus on my book, my eyes skimming over the pages without actually absorbing anything. Elena was in the kitchen, cleaning up after lunch. I could hear the clatter of dishes, the soft hum of her voice as she moved about the room. I told myself to stay put, to leave her alone, to not risk making things worse. But something inside me, something I couldn't control, drew me to her. I stood up, my heart racing as I made my way to the kitchen. I paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment, my mind a jumble of conflicting emotions. She was standing at the sink, her back to me, her hair falling in loose waves down her shoulders. She must have sensed my presence because she turned around, her eyes meeting mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us crackled with the tension that had been building for days, weeks, maybe even longer. "We can't keep doing this," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. Elena set the dish she was holding down on the counter, wiping her hands on a towel. "I know," she replied softly, her eyes full of guilt and something else, something that mirrored the conflict I felt inside. I don't know how to stop, I admitted, the words slipping out before I could think better of them. She took a step closer, her eyes locked on mine. Neither do I. The distance between us was small, but it felt like an unbridgeable chasm. And yet, despite everything, despite the guilt, the confusion, the knowledge that this was wrong, neither of us moved away. I think about you, she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her confession. I can't stop thinking about you. I closed my eyes, the guilt surging through me. Elena, we can't. But before I could finish, she closed the distance between us, her hand reaching up to gently touch my face. Her fingers were soft, tentative, as if she wasn't sure I would let her. I know we can't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But that doesn't change how I feel. I opened my eyes, meeting her gaze. The longing, the desire, it was all there, reflected back at me. And in that moment, I knew we were standing on the edge again, teetering dangerously close to crossing the line we had come so close to before. Elena, I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. We need to stop this before it goes any further. She nodded, but her hand didn't move from my face. Her touch was light, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me, the same way it had that night in the closet. I don't know if I can, she admitted, her voice trembling. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew what she meant because I didn't know if I could stop either. The pull between us was too strong, too undeniable. And as much as I wanted to walk away, to do the right thing, I couldn't seem to let go of the desire that had taken hold of me. Before I could think better of it, I reached up, my hand gently covering hers. The contact sent another wave of heat through me, and I felt myself leaning in, the space between us disappearing. This was it, the moment of no return. I could stop now, walk away, and try to salvage what was left of my sanity. Or I could give in to the desire that had been building for weeks, months, maybe even longer. I made my choice. My lips met hers in a kiss that was soft at first, hesitant, but quickly grew more urgent. Her fingers tightened in my hair, pulling me closer, and I felt myself sinking into her, the weight of everything else falling away. The world outside disappeared, and all that mattered was the heat of her body against mine, the taste of her lips, the feeling of finally giving in to the desire that had been simmering between us for so long. The kiss deepened, and before I knew it, I was pulling her closer, my hands sliding down her back, feeling the curve of her body against mine. Her breath hitched as my fingers brushed her waist, and I could feel the heat between us rising, the tension that had been building for so long finally spilling over. There was no stopping it now. We had crossed the line, and everything else, our guilt, our shame, the consequences, faded into the background. Elena responded with equal intensity, her hands gripping my shoulders as she pressed herself closer to me. The sound of her breathing, the feel of her body moving against mine, overwhelmed my senses. My mind screamed that this was wrong, but my body wouldn't listen. I had wanted this for so long, denied it for so long, that now, in the heat of the moment, it was impossible to turn back. We stumbled backward, my hand catching the edge of the kitchen counter to steady us. Elena's fingers traced the line of my jaw before pulling me back to her, the kiss becoming more heated, more urgent. I could feel the depth of her desire in every touch, every gasp that escaped her lips. The need between us was undeniable, and I let myself get swept up in it, forgetting everything else. But even as I gave in to the moment, a part of me was acutely aware of the danger we were in. Emily could come home at any time. One wrong move, one slip, and everything would be exposed. The fear of being caught only heightened the intensity, fueling the fire that raged between us. And yet, despite that fear, I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. Elena's hand slid under my shirt, her fingers warm against my skin. I shivered at her touch, my breath catching in my throat. Every nerve in my body was on edge, electrified by the feel of her, the smell of her perfume, the way her lips moved against mine. I've wanted this for so long, she whispered against my mouth, her voice thick with desire. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was too clouded with lust, too overwhelmed by the rush of emotions coursing through me. All I could do was kiss her harder, pulling her closer, wanting more, needing more. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, reality crashed back in. A noise, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My heart stopped. Emily. I pulled away from Elena, my chest heaving as panic seized me. She looked at me, wide-eyed, her lips swollen from the kiss, her breathing just as ragged as mine. Emily's home, I whispered, the words barely making it past the lump in my throat. For a moment, we just stood there, frozen in place, the weight of what we had done hanging between us. The kiss, the touch, the desire, it had all been so overwhelming, but now, faced with the reality of the situation, the guilt came rushing back in full force. We can't let her know, I said, my voice shaking with fear and regret. She can't find out. Elena nodded, her expression filled with the same guilt and confusion that was tearing me apart. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We scrambled to put ourselves back together, smoothing out our clothes, wiping the heat from our faces, trying to erase any evidence of what had just happened. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I was sure Emily would hear it the second she walked through the door. The front door opened, and I could hear the familiar sound of Emily's footsteps in the hallway. I took a deep breath, forcing a smile as I tried to steady my breathing. Hey, she called out from the front door. I'm back. Elena and I exchanged a quick, panicked glance before I called back, my voice as steady as I could manage. Hey, how was your day? Emily appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, a bright smile on her face as she set down the shopping bags she had brought in with her. It was good. Picked up a few things for dinner. What have you two been up to? Just cleaning up after lunch, Elena replied smoothly, her voice perfectly calm despite the chaos that had just unfolded. Emily glanced between us, completely unaware of the tension that still simmered just beneath the surface. She smiled, oblivious, and for a moment, I almost felt sick with guilt. How could I stand here, smiling at my wife, pretending that nothing had happened, when just minutes ago I had been wrapped in her sister's arms? But I had no choice. I had to pretend. I had to act like everything was fine, like nothing had changed. Because if Emily ever found out, I couldn't even begin to imagine what that would do to her, to us. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of normalcy, but the weight of what had happened never left me. Elena and I barely spoke, exchanging only the most necessary words, our glances avoiding one another as much as possible. The guilt was suffocating, and yet, beneath it all, the desire still lingered. I tried to push it down, tried to forget what had happened. But the memory of her touch, her kiss, stayed with me, a constant reminder of the line we had crossed. And no matter how much I tried to deny it, I knew that this wasn't over. The next few days were unbearable. I couldn't get Elena out of my mind. Every time she was around, I felt the tension coil tighter inside me. And every time she wasn't, I replayed our stolen moments in my head, the guilt gnawing at me even as I tried to convince myself it hadn't gone too far. But it had. Emily, blissfully unaware, carried on as usual. She and Elena spent their days together, laughing and reminiscing about old times. I did my best to keep up appearances, but the more time passed, the harder it became to hide the guilt. The harder it became to pretend that everything was fine when, deep down, I knew I had betrayed the woman I loved. It all came to a head one evening, when Emily suggested we all go out to dinner, just the three of us. I wanted to decline, to stay as far away from Elena as possible, but Emily was so excited about the idea that I couldn't say no. We went to a small restaurant on the edge of town, a place we had been to many times before. But this time, the atmosphere felt different. Every glance between Elena and me felt loaded with unspoken tension. Every word we exchanged felt like we were tiptoeing around a live wire. I could barely concentrate on the conversation, my mind consumed with the memory of her touch, her kiss. By the time the evening was over, I felt like I was about to snap. I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt, the desire, the constant weight of what had happened between us. I needed to put an end to it, once and for all. After dinner, we returned home, and Emily went straight upstairs to get ready for bed. Elena lingered in the living room, her eyes flicking to mine as if she could sense that something was about to happen. I followed her into the kitchen, my heart racing, my mind spinning with everything I needed to say. This had to stop. We had to stop. Elena, I said, my voice low, but filled with the weight of everything I had been holding back. She turned to face me, her expression guarded, as if she already knew what was coming. I know, she whispered before I could say anything more. I know we need to stop. The admission hung between us, heavy and fraught with the tension that had been building for days. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the same guilt that had been eating away at me. But I could also see something else, something that terrified me because I felt it too. The desire, the longing. It was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for just one moment of weakness to spill over. We can't keep doing this, I said, my voice thick with emotion. This, whatever this is, it has to end. Elena nodded, but she took a step closer, her eyes locked on mine. I know, she whispered again, her voice trembling.
But I don't know how to stop.
I swallowed hard, my hands balling into fists at my sides. We have to, I said, more to myself than to her.
We don't have a choice.
But even as I said the words, I felt myself weakening. She was so close, the scent of her perfume filling the small space between us, her presence overwhelming. I wanted to walk away, to do the right thing, but I couldn't. My body betrayed me, my mind swirling with the memory of that kiss, of everything we had almost done. Elena, I started, my voice breaking with the weight of my own internal conflict. We need to end this before it destroys everything. I know, she said softly, her hand reaching out to touch mine. The moment her skin touched mine, something inside me snapped. The tension, the guilt, the desire, it all came crashing down, and before I could stop myself, I pulled her into me. Our lips met in a desperate, hungry kiss, and all the restraint, all the guilt, evaporated in an instant. I couldn't think, couldn't stop. All I could feel was her body pressed against mine, her hands in my hair, the heat of her touch burning through me like fire. We stumbled back, our bodies colliding with a counter, the kiss deepening as we lost ourselves in each other. It was reckless, dangerous, but I couldn't stop. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. Not now. Her fingers traced the back of my neck, sending shivers down my spine, and I pulled her closer, my hands sliding down her waist. The tension that had been building for so long exploded, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not Emily, not the consequences, only this, only us. But then, just as quickly as it had started, reality came crashing back in. I heard a noise upstairs, the sound of footsteps, of Emily moving around. My heart stopped, the guilt rushing back in full force. I pulled away from Elena, breathless and shaken, my chest heaving with the weight of what we had just done. We have to stop, I said again, my voice barely a whisper. Elena nodded, her eyes filled with the same guilt and confusion that mirrored my own. I know, she whispered, her voice trembling. We stood there in the dark kitchen, the silence between us heavy and thick with the weight of what had just happened. The desire was still there, the longing still burning between us, but the guilt, the shame, was stronger now. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone, and there was no going back. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice breaking with the weight of my regret. Elena looked at me, her eyes filled with sadness and something else, something that told me she understood, but that didn't make it any easier. I'm sorry too, she said softly. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen, the weight of everything crashing down around me. I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes as the guilt washed over me. What had I done? How could I have let things get this far? I loved Emily, there was no doubt about that, But the attraction, the pull I felt toward Elena, it was undeniable. But now, standing here in the aftermath of everything, I knew one thing for certain. This couldn't continue. I had to find a way to stop it before it destroyed everything. But even as I made that decision, I knew that the feelings I had for Elena wouldn't disappear so easily. I didn't know what the future held, whether I could ever truly move past this, whether things between Emily and me could ever be the same. All I knew was that I had to try. I had to put an end to this before it was too late. But as I stood there, the memory of Elena's touch still fresh in my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if it already was.